was wondering if it's maybe just a case of BFAP and BER working together long enough that we've indoctrinated them on our positive view of agriculture. But we'll take it from the macroeconomists. So the bar's been set in terms of amount of information in a short time. I always feel like I have an unenviable task of sharing an entire book in 30 minutes, but I'm going to give it my best shot, so I think we can jump right into it. The overview of the baseline as we see it. We'll start in the spirit that Matlo presented in the beginning by looking back before we look forward. So if you look at the chart on screen, it's very busy in true BFAP style. But there's a few clear factors, I think, that come out. So it shows basically year-on-year changes in real GDP for agriculture and for the South African economy. And there's no prizes for guessing which one is agriculture in that mix. I think it's very clear that it's a lot more volatile than the general economy, obviously faced with many external factors. But what's also clear is that if you look on average for the past 20 years, agriculture has grown 3% compared to 2% in the general economy. So that's a significant difference in terms of outpacing the general economy in terms of growth. What's also clear is that it has slowed quite a bit in recent years. So the chart I just brought up shows you some individual sectors in the economy. Basically looking from 2017 to 2023 in green. And there you can see agriculture right at the bottom, the second best performer of the lot. And then the blue one shows just the past 3 years, and then this doesn't look quite so good anymore. Then we've dropped to third from the bottom. So you can see that growth in agriculture has slowed significantly. But I think if you just look at that chart in general, it also shows a clear ability to bounce back, the resilience of the sector to come back after the sector takes these knocks. And there's some factors highlighted there in terms of what's driven growth. We've had commodity price cycles, weather conditions internationally, weather conditions in South Africa. Obviously, things like the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, things that we don't control as agriculture. But there's also been some factors within the sector that have been particularly constraining, things like animal disease outbreaks and so forth, which we argue that we can do something about. So all of this, I think, just to bear this picture in mind as we start looking forward then. So let's do that by way of subsector for now. So what you see on screen is in real terms, so adjusted for inflation, and that's revenue, so it doesn't consider costs as of yet. But it gives you some view of the sectors that drove performance historically and also how we see them going forward. And I think, again, it's quite clear if you think these past few years when agriculture did so well, it was very much underpinned by the field crop sector, that blue line. We were in a situation where we had fantastic yields, we had very high world prices. It's a combination that we don't always see together. And I think we really benefited from that. The reality is also that we will come down from that because many of those external factors aren't around anymore. So we have to be realistic about that. I think what's good to see is if you look at a previous low price cycle, while prices are coming down again, we're entering into a next lower price cycle. We don't fall to the level that we were in those previous low price cycles. And I think that speaks to the investments made in the upswing that then enable us to plateau out a little bit higher than what we did before. We know there will be volatility in future. We don't see it here because much of it is weather induced. But if we can keep doing this, we can keep this cycle, we can keep investing in the good cycles, we can keep landing higher in the next down cycle. If you also look back, previous down cycle was good for livestock because that's, of course, what gives us the animal feed. But we would argue that in those previous cycles, the general demand environment and the economic environment for our consumers was a little bit stronger. So we don't see that same extent of growth, particularly in the short term currently, because of that constraint. But of course, if we end up in Shannon's more positive scenario, then this can look a little bit different. So we have to also acknowledge that. The last one is then horticulture, which is an interesting sector. I mean, if you look 10, 15 years back, it was our core driver of growth. It's flattened off a lot in recent years, even declined a little bit. But 2023 was a lot better, and I think 2023, again, benefiting from external factors, gave some breathing space to many in that industry. And I think looking forward, at least from a revenue perspective, we see it a little bit more positively as volumes continue to come into that sector. But we have to caveat that and say, firstly, These products mainly get exported. They need to go through our ports, so we need to sort that out to enable growth. And secondly, this doesn't do costs. So if we flip to the next one, we'll give you some view on costs. On the left-hand side, we've got some main cost drivers, not all of them, and they're sort of color-coded here. So we've got fuel, fertilizer, herbicides, insecticides. Those are your core ones on the field crop side. On the grey ones, we've got labor, electricity, which speaks to irrigation. Those are obviously big drivers on the horticulture side, and then feed and green. Those are all contrasted with the CPI, and I think that's a clear first point, that costs have increased well above CPI levels historically. Contrast that on the right-hand side, we've got some prices, again, major field crops, some horticultural products, and our livestock. And then comes the second point, that for the most part, these costs have been a lot stronger than what we've seen on the price side. So if we look at the outlook for these, the core imported ones, your fertilizer, which is imported, your herbicides, pesticides, some of them are still coming down. If the rand strengthens a little bit more, maybe they'll come down a little bit more. In the medium term, we are looking at increasing again, roughly 1.5% per annum on average over that 10-year period from the levels we're now. So we dip a little bit, and then we grow a little bit stronger. Feed, of course, we do expect to come down with those grain prices, but we have to acknowledge there's also a cost to manufacture feed. And then the horticulture ones, again, these are a little bit more sticky. If you think electricity tariffs, I can't imagine they'll be below inflation soon. And if you think wages, I also can't imagine that they'll be below inflation soon. So I think that sector is probably the most exposed in terms of rising cost structure, at least over the next few years. Much of what sits underneath this is also global dynamics, and I think here we've taken a really long-term view on world prices, again in real terms, so adjusted for inflation. We've gone back 50 years, we can also go back 100 years, the trend is the same. Real agricultural commodity prices are coming down. We have seen spikes, the latest of which is the one that we saw in the recent past with the pandemic and logistical constraints and the ongoing war in Ukraine. But we've seen them start to come down, and we'll show that also a little bit later on. We've had a lot of area expansion as those prices rose. We had some tough weather to start. Now the weather's playing along, and we're looking at record crops this year for most major grains and oilseeds at a global level. So those prices are coming down, and I think if you just look at that trend long term, it's clear that if you're not growing productivity, you're going to be in real trouble. I think the good news is we still have an agricultural sector globally, so we've managed to do this in the past. We just need to sustain it. The other side of it that also drives a little bit of a decline again in the outlook in real terms is that the demand side is also slowing. And I think if you look globally, there's multiple factors that we should consider in terms of driving demand. We've highlighted some of them here. Of course, there's the global economy. We are looking at slower growth. We've seen Shannon's presentation there. There are risks in many places. What also came out from hers, and I didn't take this from her, this is actually from the OECD FAO outlook, is that the role of India and Southeast Asia is increasing compared to China. So if we look back to the past 10, 15 years, China was the core primary driver of demand in the agricultural space. Their population is expected to decline, their growth is slowing, so that role is getting comparatively smaller. And you've got rising stars, as Shannon called it, in India and Southeast Asia that's increasingly playing a role. Now, why this is important is because, of course, income levels will influence it. But your general demand trends and what people like to eat and so forth in these regions is not always the same. If you think of India, there's a big vegetarian population. So there's a lot of other factors to consider in terms of what the demand mix might look like. Of course, other things, the geopolitical fragmentation, the trade environment, it makes the international trade environment complex. And you'll see from this presentation that we need that international trade environment to grow. So that's an important point. And then, of course, sustainability. Matlo mentioned right at the beginning that it's high on the agenda, so it's influencing the demand mix, it's influencing the demand for things like vegetable oils that go into biofuel. It's driving that side, it's driving the policy space in many instances. If you think like a region like the EU, it's quite influential in their agricultural policy to the extent that it may influence prospects for productivity growth in that region, which can again influence prices and so forth. So if we come back home, I guess, the situation's not much better. So this speaks to the South African demand environment. And again, consumer demand is still under a lot of pressure. I feel like we say this every year. I also feel like it's getting progressively worse. So if you just look at that chart, that's household disposable income expressed in per capita terms. Nominal in blue, real in green, and a percentage change year on year in orange. So I think the orange is the one worth looking at. And firstly, from 2013 to 2023, there's only 0.3% in real terms there. So only 0.3% more than inflation in income. If you look at a count back of the 10 years, 5 of them were negative. So we had 5 positive, 5 negative. We had one big contraction in COVID. We had one big bounce back after. The rest is marginally negative or marginally positive. The implication of that is if we just look at living standards, we're plotting there the share of the South African population that falls in low-income groups, middle-income groups, and more affluent groups. And I think this is a really striking picture. So if you look back in history, we were coming down on the lower, rising in the middle, and rising in the upper. Now we have sort of plateaued, marginally increasing on the lower, flattened off almost completely on the middle, and declining on the upper. So this is, of course, a concerning picture if you just think spending power within your population. And this influences what people buy, how much of things they consume, and so forth. So it's very important to consider in our agricultural outlook. Here you see some of the impact of that. So the chart on the left, again, that shows just over the past 5 years, the percentage change in consumption domestically, not internationally, and the percentage change in production of some core agricultural commodities. So we've tried to put a spread there. We've got some fruits, we've got potatoes, we've got dairy products, some core grains, meat products. And I think the first striking point is just how many of them are negative for that 5-year period. The second one is probably which ones are positive. So maize and wheat as core staples stands out. And we see that. We've seen a stronger demand for those basic food staples and a weaker demand for your higher value products. This would suggest that consumers are switching back a little bit to basics. I think there are some positives there. Look at pork. That's obviously one of our meat types that's grown very quickly. It has become relatively a lot more affordable compared to other meat types, and that's part of what underpins that picture, why we see rising consumption, whereas others have predominantly declined. So I think this is, if our economic performance increases, if it improves, if we're looking at a faster growth rate, of course the situation can turn around a little bit quicker. But for the most part, over the past 5 years, we've grown production a lot stronger than what we've seen domestic demand grow. So we have operated in international markets. We can, and we will have to. I think if we, in the short term at least, if we want to accelerate growth, this has to be core to our strategy. So with that, we can focus, a short focus on the individual subsectors. Some key points from livestock. So I start with livestock because this is probably most influenced by the picture that I just showed you with spending power. The bulk of the product goes into the local market, even though trade is getting more important. And we'll have to look beyond that market if we really are to ignite growth. In order to do that, we have to solve animal health. Again, I feel like we say this every year, but we'll keep saying it because it is probably the biggest thing that we need to fix to unlock growth in our livestock industry. And then also to say that there's been immense cost pressure there. Obviously, the high price cycle on our grains and oilseeds have been great for them, but not so great for our livestock producers who use it as feed. And beyond that, also through the value chain, the cost of adding value, things like electricity, labor, all of those costs that add up between your producer price and your retail price also influences affordability for your consumer at the end of the day. So this is the 10-year view on livestock, showing you total growth in consumption projected by 2033 compared to the last 3 years as an average for a base period. Disaggregates what's produced locally and what's imported. It gives you also in the black blocks, we've got the share of imports in total consumption, or conversely, if they're orange, then the share of production that gets exported. So we show our net exporters and importers differently there. And I think what's striking from that, firstly, is that the growth for a 10-year period is not that much. Again, driven more so by population and a little bit of per capita gains in the second half of the outlook, when our economic outlook looks a little bit better. Also, the ones that are growing are the ones that are affordable. And I think in this consumer environment, affordability just becomes more important. So you've got pork that's got relatively cheaper compared to other meats that's growing. You've got eggs growing faster, where we have actually prices coming down as we recover from the bird flu. And then we've got chicken, which is, of course, the bigger one, but also always your most affordable source of animal protein. So that one is growing quite quickly as well. I think for all commodities that are net importers, the share is coming down, and for all commodities that are net exporters, the share is increasing. Again, speaks to this, we'll need to grow consumption faster than what we see demand in our local market. What's also important to say is that some imports in our importing industries, if you think pork and poultry, will always remain. There are some cuts, there are some products that we will continue to import because it's a market balance issue. I think of things like mechanically deboned meat. I think of things like ribs, because our consumers just love ribs much more than the rest of the pig carcass, apparently. We'll always have those. So while we do decrease the share, there always will be some. Our exports are rising, but again, animal health. We have to sort this issue if we want to accelerate it. There's a lot more potential than what we're showing here. So this will always only be a limited share for the same reason. It's specific parts of the carcass that we export, but we can do a lot more than what we're currently doing if we fix a few levers. So let's look at imports. I've asked the question here, chicken imports have declined substantially, but how much more can we do? And that has to do with product mix. So if you look at where imports increased 140% over an 8-year period, and we've actually declined, we've pulled that back 33% over the last 5 years. But we are running out of space a little bit here. So if this is all centered in one group and one specific cut, then our options are getting less and less, and we'll have to swing our attention to more exports as a balance with us if we're going to accelerate growth substantially over the outlook. This is something that the beef industry has done. I think the performance in the export markets is probably a core explainer of the ups and downs that we've seen in our beef industry in recent years. But if you just look at the longer term trend, we'll see that the share of your higher value cuts, your boneless pieces, fresh frozen, the share of that in total exports has increased quite substantially. And this speaks to the targets in the industry. So I've noted before, it's a very specific part of the carcass that gets exported. It's never everything. And I think to me, this is also a positive, because it means if we drive exports of these cuts, we unlock additional value, and we support faster growth in the industry. It also means that we're pushing more of other cuts into our local market, which means we can get more affordable products to our South African consumers. And these two things can go together, and I think they should, and I think it's also key in the strategy that the industry has developed. It is not easy out there. It is the global market is not growing everywhere. So on the map, I'm just showing increases or lack thereof of per capita demand globally for beef. So we're not picking on the beef industry. We just had to choose one to dive deeper into. But you'll see there's a lot of red there. So many countries are actually decreasing beef consumption. In many instances, it's an affordability issue. In many instances, it's non-economic factors, things like sustainability and concern for the environment, particularly in our developed countries, that's influencing this. That doesn't mean that there's not scope to grow imports. So that's the import picture. It's the other side of it. And the good news is more countries are green there than what we see on the consumption side. There are resource constraints. There are countries that will import more. But the reality is that there's also a lot of competitive exporters. And we're going to have to be really on top of our game if we're going to enter into these markets to grow our sector. For that, I've noted competitiveness is key. This is a figure that we often show as a rough indicator of profitability. So it's basically just a meat to maize ratio for the different meat types. We've got dotted lines for international levels. We've got solid lines for South African levels. And again, I think some key things stand out. If you just look from 2020 to 2023, that's declined across the board in South Africa, internationally, for all meat types. I think that's the situation we're in, given the price cycle that we saw. What's also clear is that things have reversed internationally and not yet so much in South Africa. So there are small caveats. We saw poultry increase a little bit when prices rose with bird flu. But for the most part, we have seen it improve internationally, whereas in South Africa, the drought that we had, the more expensive grains and oilseeds as a result of that, has hit the brakes a little bit. What is also true is that they do improve going forward, so we do catch up, and that's very much to do with us catching up in that crop price cycle as well. Across all of these industries, we do see these ratios improving over the outlook, not to the levels that we saw in say, 2017-18, that really pushed growth in many of them. But things are looking better, and I think that's always a positive. This is our biggest subsector, so if we think growth in agriculture, of course, that is a positive thing to consider. And then maybe just to single out pork, because I think there the difference between international and local is quite striking in that our prices don't rise as much because we're expanding production quite strongly. Conversely, you have some big players like Europe where people are not expanding despite high prices because there's too many other constraints in terms of environment, welfare, and so forth. So if we just pull that through to the outlook for our beef sector, you've got the production in the back, the shaded area. Very volatile in the past. We've had drought periods where we slaughtered into the herd. We've had some expansion. We had herd expansion when our crop industries were doing well. But all in all, only around 3% per annum growth within that volatility. Over the outlook, we see that a little bit stronger. Again, that's part of it is volumes coming in from the expansionary cycle, from the herd building cycle that we've been in. Part of it is the better beef to maize ratios, which also enable us to pay a little bit more for the calf. So you'll see that the beef to calf ratio is declining there, which ensures that we get enough supply of weaner calves into the system. Again, there's some caveats. Currently, we're exporting 4%. By the outlook, we have it at 7%. This is the baseline picture. This is not the beef strategy picture. I know Devil's sitting there, and they worked hard on that strategy. But there's some things that need to be implemented and things that need to be fixed to really unlock that strategy. So I think it's an industry that's done great work in terms of putting the vision out there and what can be done. They've bought into the AMP goals and opportunities and developed that strategy accordingly to unlock it. And as that starts to be implemented, I think this will also start to look up. As a last livestock slide, I wanted to come back to the point we started with on the costs of doing business. So here we're plotting producer prices and retail prices for different beef cuts and for poultry on the left-hand side. So there you've got a view over time, and I think it's clear that those prices are diverging, which is of course not something that we always want to see. On the right, we just saw 3 periods, so 2012, 2019, 2024, and I think from that it's quite clear that the difference between them is rising quite quickly. And I think this is where the cost of doing business really comes in, the cost of adding value. Things like electricity, logistics, water, security, regulatory compliance, all of that is adding costs in the value chain that ultimately, when you have producer prices coming down, we don't see the full benefit on the retail side. And I think if we can reduce that cost of doing business in the chain, we can really start to make a significant difference in terms of affordability for our consumer, which then enables faster growth on the demand side. So let's go to field crops. I've noted before, world prices are coming down. When our crop normalizes, we'll be faced with that as well. We haven't seen the full extent of it, but we will. That implies that margins will come down. And again, I want to say this sector has had a few really, really strong years, so this is always inevitable. But then also to say that in this environment, it's going to be all about productivity, which means that any technology that can enhance productivity, we need to register as efficiently, as quickly as possible for our producers to adopt to really stay on top of that curve. Let's look at some numbers. So on the left, I've got percentage changes in prices for major crops, internationally in green and in blue domestically. So that's just the first 6 months of 2024 compared to the first 6 months of 2023. I think the difference is very striking. We've kept saying that global prices are coming down and we haven't seen it yet. I think that picture shows it very clearly. Many of these world reference prices have almost reached pre-pandemic levels. And I think in the uncertain environment the world is operating in, that's quite a feat to say that we're almost back to pre-pandemic levels. If you look at the price outlook on the right, we've just encircled the drought impact there. It's clear also that we are expecting to catch up. So if we have a bigger crop in 2025, which is, I guess, increasingly likely with things like La Nina coming back and so forth, but even just a normal crop in 2025 will likely see us back to export parity levels, which means that our prices will come down. And if our rand strengthens further, given current sentiment, then that will expose us even more to that trend. So that's a reality that we're faced with. It's probably not something that we can change. Again, it will be volatile, weather will fluctuate, we need to ensure that we benefit from the cycles, but this is fundamentally the trend as we see it, given market fundamentals. That has an implication, of course, for margins. So this is just an aggregate index, thanks to our summer crop, our field crop team. So we've got summer crops, dryland, summer crops, irrigation, and winter crops under dryland conditions. And there, again, there's a few things that you can see. So winter crops never increased to the same extent as summer. They had price benefits, but they didn't have the same exceptional yield levels that we saw in summer crops. It was always going to come down. It has. Again, same point as before. I think if you look where the equilibrium sits, where these margins stabilize, is above the 2018-2019 levels. So yes, we are coming down, but we're not falling back into negative territory. Of course, there's some factors underpinning that. Regional differences were there for sure. The drought impact was different in some regions than others, so all of that we must consider. But this is the aggregate picture. So on average, for the country, we are coming down, but not below the 2018-19 levels. Our winter crops didn't increase as much. They also don't fall as far because, of course, if you think of something like wheat, we've got that variable import tariff that kicks in when world prices fall below the reference price. So it gives us a little bit of a floor and a little bit of a buffer in terms of how far prices fall, and then you've got barley connected to that and so forth. Let's just look at productivity. We keep saying that productivity is key. So just to say, we have done this before. We can do this. We can ramp up productivity. On the chart, you see a 5-year average yield levels for South Africa and some main competitors in our major crops. That's the bars. Then you've got the diamond, which shows the average annual change in yields over the past 10 years. And that's remarkable if you look at some of those numbers. 4.5%, 5% per annum in many of these industries. And I think that is to some extent influenced by the great years that we've had in the recent past. But there was a lot of factors that contributed. We had new technology coming in, specifically seed technology, that made a big difference for us, particularly in soybeans. And also, if you look at the oilseeds, that's also where we expect growth to remain stronger because there's still more of that in the pipeline. So there's still more of that can come in, that can help us. Within this good cycle, we've seen immense investment in things like machinery, bigger machinery, unlocking scale benefits, precision machinery, all of this which gives us productivity gains. I want to just caution, or caveat, I don't know what is the right word. Our outlook on yields is generally positive, but we are assuming that these new technologies that continue to come, we can adopt. And I think if you look at things like new breeding technologies, the lack of alignment with international standards that we have in South Africa and the implication of that for bringing new products in, if we don't get these new products in, we're going to struggle to sustain this. So while we're saying that it's critical to do it, it's critical that we put everything in place and that we ensure that seeds, but also beyond that, chemicals, insecticides, all that stuff can be registered quickly and efficiently in order to enable these gains. Impact on area, this is of course the other side of production. There you've got total summer crop and total winter crop areas, summer crops on the left, winter crops on the right. So just note the scale difference. If you look long term, this has pretty much been declining, and Fadi will show you later an even longer term picture. But in the recent past, when we had this high price cycle, we saw those aggregate areas come up. And again, as prices come down, we do expect them to consolidate, we do expect them to decline, but not to the levels that we had in the previous lower price cycle. So again, we're catching them a little bit higher, And I think that's positive news for our industry. If you look at what the mix within that total area picture, the chart at the bottom shows you just cereals versus oilseeds. I think that's quite striking, the growing share of oilseeds historically, also in the future. And if you look at those percentage changes, soybeans 25%, canola 36%, we are expecting the oilseeds to stay stronger than the grains. Part of that is because we're still getting stronger productivity gains there. Part of it's because of the benefits in the rotation system, yield benefits on your grains, reduction in costs in terms of management of pests and weeding and so forth. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. Relative profitability is one, and then of course also the various roles in the system. I think if you look at something like canola that's growing very strongly, that's increasingly looking at options in our irrigated regions as a rotation crop there. So there's a lot going on and sitting behind this picture, but that's sort of the overview that we see. If we just look at the implied production volumes and how we use it, so here we've got domestic use stacked on net exports, or alternatively if it's net imports at the bottom. And here we want to come back to that consumer environment picture. So look at maize to start. We're now with 13% growth in food use, 17% in feed use, they're almost equal. If you go back 3, 4, 5 years, there would have been less than a third of growth in the food side compared to the feed side. And I think if you take a longer term view on maize consumption in South Africa, it was actually coming down and now it's going back up again. So for our basic products, if I can call them that, we're using more of them domestically, we're exporting a smaller share. This is not to say that we won't have big export years. Remember the volatility. If we have these bumper crops, we'll have bigger surpluses and we need to get it out efficiently. Otherwise, we don't get that bounce back effect. But in a normal year, in an average year, we expect a smaller share to be exported. Contrast that with something like soybeans, which is predominantly for animal feed. We've had huge success here. We've grown area immensely. Lots of additional volume crushed. We've replaced imports on the oil side. We've replaced imports on the meal side. But now we're maturing a little bit as an industry. So we're struggling with that last bit of import replacement on the coast because of our logistics costs, and Fadi will speak to that later. And now we're in a situation where you have to ask ourselves, if we're going to need more processing capacity over the outlook, are we going to invest in that and crush, or are we going to export the raw material? As it's sitting currently in the baseline, we're exporting more and more beans because of the demand environment on the animal feed side and that logistics issue. If those things ramp up or clear up, then of course we can crush more beans locally and export less and add that value. Just a last point on maize, and maybe just going into the region quickly. So I think it's well known that we've exported a lot of white maize this year. The Southern African region is very short of maize. So if we just look year to date, the first 6 months of 2024, that's already exceeding the full year of 2022 and 2023. The question that we always ask is, what does this imply? So obviously we're very short in the region this year. We had El Nino, we had short production in all of our big players. Zambia is very short, which is normally a net exporter. The only one that really has a surplus except there is Tanzania, which is supplying a lot of these markets. But is this just an intermittent opportunity that we'll benefit from every now and then? What is the future of it? Is it we have some flexibility, we can switch maize between feed and food markets, and white maize going out into the region and yellow maize going out into the global market. But what this really looks like in the future is very dependent on what our neighbors do and what the rest of the continent does in terms of production. So luckily we have some partners in the region, and we've been working on an African outlook as well for many years. So Anthony's in the audience here, and Tanash from the ANAPRI network. Many of our partners across Africa are part of that network. But let's just have a quick look at production prospects for maize specifically in a few selected countries. So we have Zim. It's increased very, very much recently. It's expanded area. We've seen yield gains, not this year in the drought, but before that. A lot of that's also weather related. I think there's a lot of potential there, but the environment is still very difficult. So for the longer term, we still see it as a net importer. We've got Kenya, which will probably always be a net importer. So it's been, the last few years when they had the big drought was difficult, and we had a bounce in the recovery. But from a resource perspective, it's probably a country that's always going to be importing maize. Of course, the GM policy, if that changes, could be a game changer there. Uganda, which grew very strongly in the past, again flattened out when we had the droughts in East Africa, but we foresee a lot of growth potential there. So strong yield gains if that resumes, and that's a typical supplier into Kenya. Tanzania, again, massive area planted, a lot of scope to grow yields, but quite sensitive markets. If you push a lot of volume, you see prices quite responsive. Zambia, same story, a lot of potential to expand. They're under pressure this year, but there's a lot of growth that can come from that country. It's become a fairly consistent surplus producer, which we typically struggle to compete with in a normal year. But they do, from time to time, interfere in that market, and I think that's also created some opportunities for us in the past. And then, of course, Malawi, which is probably the most volatile of these markets, very thinly traded, very sensitive if you have a supply or a deficit in terms of the price response. I think if you just look at the big picture there, despite projected yield gains in the region, by 2030, if you look at those absolute levels, and you think of what we get in a country like South Africa, there's huge potential to scale that up. So there's a lot of additional production that can come from this region. But it's also not always simple. So if we just look at Zambia as an example, here we've got some gross margins for maize and soybeans, small producers and commercial producers. So typically what you find, you have a big crop. Zambia, when they're supplying themselves and a few neighboring countries, it's fairly sustainable, the margins look good. Then they have a big crop, it needs to move beyond that. You need to move it 1 or 2 countries further or out the port through Beira and a deep sea export parity. And then your margins go negative, so you have production again pulling back, people switching out into other things. So this would suggest that unless we fix these, at least these logistics and transport challenges, we'll probably struggle to be a big, consistent surplus producer in the region, which suggests there is always that intermittent opportunity for us. But this one still says that the potential is endless. So if we can fix these market issues, if we can fix these logistical and transport cost issues, get the 3-week round trip to move maize meal from South Africa through to DRC and back down to a few days, then it starts to become a very different picture in terms of trade possibilities and production possibilities. So last one is horticulture. So just a quick run through on our core messages there. I've said before, this is an industry we've had a lot of investment. If you look back in the past 10 years, production expanded, volumes came into the market, prices pushed down. They hit a lot of snags on the logistics side and port constraints and so forth. So it's been under a lot of pressure in recent years, and 2023 was a much better one. I think we'll see that now in the charts. But we have seen investment into this industry really slow, and of course this is where we absorb the bulk of our labor in agriculture. So this is not really a picture that we want to see, and I think going forward we're looking more and more on really maximizing those returns per hectare rather than large-scale expansion of hectares further. So this is just prices. Again, average annual growth in real export prices, so inflation adjusted. If you just look at that picture on the orange bar, that's the past 10 years. For most of them, that's negative. Indication of those volumes coming in and the pressure that we saw as a result of that. So we had this expansion. And as those volumes came, we also, we had the pandemic and we had global logistical issues adding to our own logistical issues. So there was a lot of factors that really complicated the business environment for this industry. Look at 2023, the green one, so huge recovery in many of this. But again, there was many external factors that contributed to that. Some of them will stay and some of them will not. So we need to think about this for the outlook. Global improvements in freight rates, of course, that had a big, significant influence, but there's some flags to keep an eye on in terms of what's going on in the Middle East and so forth. There was some reduced volume in the market. Some of that had to do with El Nino and the impact in countries like Peru, which of course we expect to come back over time. And then there was also some impact from the weaker rand. So if we look forward and we really say that we need to prioritize the sustainability of these investments, the competition will be stiff. And I think the industries per subsector is, the strategies within each subsector to deal with that is quite different. But we won't have all the support externally that we had this year, but at least some of them one would like to think would stay there to put us on a better path. The one that's complete contrast to fruit is wine. So this is wine grape area, and I think if you just look back the last 10 years, we've lost more than 11,000 hectares of wine grapes that wasn't replaced. A lot of differences regionally, regions like Northern Cape, Klein Karoo, Olifantsriver, Swartland, that's where the biggest decline occurred. There are also regions like Bredekloof, Worcester, Robertson, where the share of new area is still substantial. So there is some vines still being established in those regions. Because of this picture with production coming down so significantly, we do see real prices in that industry actually stabilizing and rising a little bit. I think that's partly also the industry strategy. They need to premiumize, they need to unlock additional value, but that should stabilize hectares at least in the outlook and maybe add a little bit compared to the decline that we've seen historically. If we contrast that with fruit, 32% over the past 10 years. We've just stacked the major fruit products there on top of each other. So huge expansion in area that is part of what contributed to the price pressure. It has already slowed a lot. And if you look at the outlook, that's super flat. There's not really any area being added in that sector over the outlook. That doesn't mean there's no volume. I think if we've showed this picture a number of times. And I think for those that can remember what it looked like before, this might be quite striking. So if I were to compare this to 3-4 years ago, that share of non-bearing area in the total has decreased substantially. So part of that is just those young trees that are actually now coming in and starting to contribute to production. And there's still some of them, many of them are still, that share is still bigger than what would be considered a normal cycle and within it. But some of them, if we don't start replacing again soon, is actually starting to move to the wrong end of that cycle now. And I think that's a concern to flag for the industry, and that we need to pick up that replacement cycle again to ensure that that whole environment is sustainable. I've said it doesn't mean that there's no volume coming. There's still productivity growth, and there is still young trees that are starting to contribute to production. So significant gains in lemons and soft citrus, but even apples, oranges, a lot of these products across the board, probably with the exception of wine and apricots, all of them still seeing significant additional volumes. If you look at that market breakdown, historically and over the outlook, these products will have to be exported. This is our market, this is the nature of this industry, which means logistics and market access. We can't overemphasize enough. These are the key enablers that will ensure sustainability in this industry. What can we do? So thanks to our horticulture team for compiling this slide, flying in by itself. 3 options. We can increase yields, we can export a greater share of our crop or export a better quality product that we get a premium for, or we can improve the efficiency of our input use. And I think many of these strategies have been applied in the industry in the recent past. If you think of citrus, they've gone with higher yielding cultivars, they've reconsidered the input mix in many industries. Pome fruit, blueberries, we've seen a lot of netting to increase the pack-out percentages to push more into exports. Grapes, also higher yielding cultivars, which reduces your cost on a per carton basis. We've seen area pull back in some of our stone fruit. We've also seen the mix of that stone fruit change, so the volumes have remained fairly constant. And then in wine, very much differences in the regions and how they've approached this and what their target markets look like. But the reality is many of these things are a trade-off, so you can't achieve the max at all of them. So you have to find the sweet spot here, the balance in the middle. And if we're going to be sustainable in the long run, we need to get all these industries closer to that sweet spot. We're almost done. I'm looking at the cheeky red screen in front of me. This is the implication for export volumes. So we've shown the different market breakdown. This is just exports. So we can get all that right at producer level and make the right decisions to make ourselves sustainable. But we need to get these volumes out. So 10 years ago, we were at 2.6 million tons. Now we're at 3.7, and by 2033, we're expecting to be at 4.5. And the reality is that this has not been smooth sailing. So again, we need the entire value chain to contribute. We need to move the product efficiently. We need to get it through the port, and we need to get it to a diverse range of markets in order to do so at sustainable prices. There's a lot of factors that need to come together with a lot of different stakeholders, but I think, just to say that it's really critical to reduce the risk, and to get this value chain sustainable, to protect those investments we've made, and to acknowledge that it's your smaller producers that are often at greatest risk when these things get difficult. So these are the guys that we also need to prioritize in terms of protecting. So just to conclude, I think we've said for some time that in a baseline, growth is not just going to be handed to us. So from the entire story that you've heard, this is real agricultural GDP, historically and also over the baseline. I won't go into details again. I think you've heard it all about what's driving that. But the reality is under the baseline, it's very flat. And this is real terms, so it's inflation has been removed from it. But just to say there are things that we can do, and I think the rest of the day we'll probably spend on things that we can do. Not too long ago, we did the Agricultural Agro-Processing Master Plan. We did some, even back then, we weren't expecting a radical baseline. Maybe it was a little bit stronger than what we are now, but it still wasn't shooting the lights out. But even then we said we have a lot more possibility. We can bend this curve upwards. There's some core factors that we need to address. There's 32 billion in real GDP that we can unlock. Some key ones I'll mention: animal health, market access, infrastructure, logistics, farmer support, investment climate. You've heard some of it in this presentation, and I think after the break, Fadi will dive a little bit deeper into some more of them and really, in the panel discussion as well, get into how we turn this picture around and how we end up here instead of here. Thank you.